Welcome to this soft and unrushed retelling of one of the most dramatic moments in London's long history. Tonight, we drift back to the year 1666 to walk slowly through narrow streets, to watch a quiet spark grow into a great fire, and then to witness how a wounded city found the strength to rise again from the ashes. Before we begin, I gently invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these peaceful journeys continue, and it means more than you know. Now, let us settle into the story. London, in the late summer of 1666, was a city alive with movement, but also burdened with years of hardship. The plague that had swept through the city the year before was only just beginning to fade, leaving behind empty houses, grieving families, and the weary relief of survivors. Yet life was returning, slowly and unevenly. Markets reopened, boats again moved along the Thames, children filled the narrow lanes with their laughter, and people dared to believe that the worst had passed. The city itself was a patchwork of wooden houses leaning toward each other in crowded streets, their upper floors so close that neighbors could shake hands from the windows. Most homes were built hastily, repaired endlessly, or expanded in ways that ignored safety, for London had grown without planning, as many medieval cities did. Shops spilled out into walkways, straw roofs, timber beams, open fireplaces, and busy workshops all combined into a place full of warmth and noise, but also full of danger. Along the riverfront, warehouses stored pitch, tar, rope, cloth, grain, and all manner of goods that fed the city's trade. These buildings were valuable, but also fragile, with their contents ready to ignite at the smallest spark. Bakers worked through the night. Blacksmiths kept their forges burning hot. The glow of embers was as common as the glow of lanterns, and because the summer had been unusually dry, even the air itself felt ready to burn. Yet despite the risks, the people of London carried on with confidence. Fires were a familiar part of life. Chimneys smoked constantly, hearths glowed warmly in nearly every home. The idea that a fire could threaten the entire city seemed distant, almost unthinkable. After all, London had many small fires each year, and most were extinguished before they caused more than local damage. But beneath this fragile sense of safety, the city held a quiet vulnerability, the kind that waits patiently, unnoticed, until just the right moment arrives. As September approached, London's citizens prepared for the coming autumn with the same mixture of caution and optimism that always marked their days. They repaired roofs, restocked shops, and welcomed travelers arriving by river. Life was returning to normal, or at least it seemed to be. For on the night of September 1st, as the moon lifted over the city and the streets grew still, a chain of events began to unfold, events so small at first, so ordinary, that no one could have predicted how suddenly they would change everything. And so, with a gentle breath, we step closer to that night, to a single bakery on Pudding Lane, where a spark was waiting. In the quiet hours of the night, when most London slept under the stillness of early September darkness, a warm glow lingered inside a bakery on Pudding Lane. It belonged to Thomas Farriner, a well-known baker who supplied bread to the Royal Navy.
His ovens had worked tirelessly through the evening, feeding sailors, merchants, and families who depended on him. By the time the last loaves were finished, the streets outside had grown hushed, touched only by the faint sounds of the river in the distance. Inside the bakery, however, heat remained trapped. The great ovens, once roaring and powerful, still throbbed with warmth long after the fires had been raked. In this world of timber beams, flour dust, and drying wood, warmth was both a friend and a hidden enemy. It kept dough rising and bakers at work, but it also clung stubbornly to every surface, waiting for the smallest breath of air to stir it into something more dangerous. As midnight passed, the Fariner family retired to bed. They lived above the shop, as most craftsmen did, climbing a narrow wooden staircase to the rooms where they slept. The city around them was calm. Lanterns flickered behind shutters. Cats prowled softly across rooftops, and the night felt peaceful, cool, and ordinary. No one knows exactly how it began. Perhaps a spark slipped through a crack in the oven door. Perhaps a pile of wood caught a small ember. Or perhaps flour dust, floating invisibly in the air, found the heat it needed to ignite. Whatever the cause, sometime in the early hours of September 2nd, a tiny flame flickered to life in the bakery's ground floor, insignificant at first, like a whisper in the dark. But London, with its dry timber and summer warmth, was ready to burn. The fire grew slowly at first, feeding on bundles of wood stacked neatly for the next morning's baking. It climbed along the beams and then reached the barrels and shelves nearby. Within minutes, it had found the oil-soaked rags used for cleaning the ovens, and the flame brightened with sudden confidence. The peaceful darkness of the bakery shifted as shadows danced across the walls, stretching like long, wavering silhouettes. Down on Pudding Lane, nothing stirred. The streets were narrow, almost tunnel-like, flanked by buildings so close that the sky above felt like a thin strip of night. When smoke began to seep through the cracks of the bakery door, it drifted upward, unnoticed. Only when the fire reached the low ceiling and began to eat into the floorboards of the rooms above did movement finally break the stillness. Thomas Fariner awoke to the smell of smoke and the soft crackle of wood. At first, still half asleep, he believed it was the oven cooling after a long night's work, a familiar scent. But then he saw the glow beneath the door, flickering unevenly, too bright and too alive to be anything harmless. He called out to his family. They scrambled from their beds as smoke thickened in the narrow stairway. Flames were spreading faster than anyone expected, racing upward and curling around the wooden banisters. Fariner tried desperately to reach the bakery door to extinguish the fire, but it was already too fierce, pushing him back with waves of heat. The family rushed toward a window overlooking the street. With smoke filling the room behind them and flames rising below, they climbed out and made their escape, desperate and breathless. They managed to reach a neighbor's roof, pulling themselves to safety as the fire consumed the bakery beneath their feet. The alarm was finally raised, but it was late. Too late for the small team of night watchmen to contain what was now becoming a hungry blaze. The fire, born in a quiet bakery, was already reaching outward, climbing to nearby houses, catching at beams and shutters dried from the long, hot summer. And as the first bells began to ring in the distance, London stirred, unaware that a long and terrible day was about to begin.
As dawn crept toward London, the fire that had begun in Thomas Fariner's bakery
had already moved beyond any hope of quiet control. The early morning sky, still pale and fragile, began to glow with an unusual light, not the soft colors of sunrise, but a restless shimmer of orange and gold. Sleepy eyes opened across the neighborhood as people stepped to their windows, confused by the strange brightness reflected along the narrow streets. On Pudding Lane, the fire had grown into a fierce, determined force. Flames leapt from one timbered house to the next with astonishing speed. Each home, dry from the long summer, ignited as though it had been waiting for that moment. The district was packed tightly, every building leaning forward, offering its beams to the fire like kindling. Smoke rose in thick curls, drifting into side streets and billowing upward in a growing plume that could be seen from far across the city. The first residents to react were the night watch, who moved quickly but without the urgency the moment required. Fires were not uncommon in London, and most could be extinguished with simple buckets of water or by tearing down nearby buildings to stop the flames from spreading. But this fire was already stronger than any they had seen in months. The heat pushed them back when they tried to approach, and the crackling roar drowned out their calls for help. Soon, neighbors emerged from their homes carrying buckets, blankets, or whatever they could find. They formed lines toward the river, passing water from hand to hand. But the flames seemed to answer with almost mocking intensity, growing faster than the people could react. Sparks flew upward and outward, landing on roofs across the street and igniting new fires before anyone noticed. The fire was no longer a single event. It was becoming a chain reaction. As panicked voices filled the air, carts clattered along the cobblestones as families rushed to gather whatever they could carry. Some packed clothing, bedding, and food. Others grabbed silverware or small chests of personal treasures. Many simply fled with nothing, their faces pale with shock. Children cried, dogs barked, and the heat continued to surge. Among those alerted to the growing threat was Sir Thomas Bloodworth, the Lord Mayor of London. He arrived reluctantly, called from his rest to assess the situation. When he reached the scene, he gazed at the flames with weary disbelief. Tradition claims that he muttered something dismissive, perhaps that the fire was easily dealt with, or that a woman could piss it out, as the legend goes. Whether or not he actually said those words, one thing is certain: he underestimated the danger. Bloodworth hesitated to order the removal of houses to create fire breaks. It was a drastic measure, one that required royal permission and compensation for those whose homes would be destroyed. And so the precious early moments slipped away while the flames advanced. The wind, which had been gentle earlier, began to strengthen. It swept through the narrow lanes like a hidden accomplice, pushing heat and sparks deeper into the city. Roofs smoldered, shutters curled inward. The fire moved with growing confidence, no longer just a neighborhood disaster, but a spreading tide of destruction. And as the morning light strengthened, people across London began to realize that something terrible was unfolding. From the riverbanks and markets to distant church towers, eyes turned toward the rising column of smoke. The city was awakening not to a normal day, but to an unfolding catastrophe, one that would reshape it forever. And as the wind fanned the flames, the fire began to move south and west toward some of the most crowded and vital parts of London.
As the sun rose higher over London on that fateful September morning, the fire had already grown into a living force,
one that seemed to breathe with the wind and pulse with ever-increasing strength. What had begun as a small spark in a bakery was now expanding outward, stretching tendrils of flame in every direction. Each gust of wind carried embers across the rooftops, and each ember found new life as it settled on dry wood. By mid-morning, the fire reached the riverfront warehouses near the Thames. These buildings, crowded with flammable goods, tar, oil, pitch, cloth, and timber, offered the flames exactly what they needed to surge forward with terrifying speed. When the fire found the first warehouse, a deep, booming sound echoed across the water, as if the building itself were exhaling in surrender. Then, one by one, the warehouses ignited, sending pillars of bright orange flame shooting skyward. The heat along the riverfront became unbearable. Sailors on nearby boats steered frantically away from the burning docks, their faces flushed from the blistering air. Flames leapt from warehouse to warehouse, and thick black smoke rolled across the Thames like a drifting storm. Some residents, fleeing with whatever belongings they could carry, rushed to the water's edge in the hope of escaping by boat. Others stood silently, staring in disbelief as familiar buildings crumbled into fiery ruin. Meanwhile, the fire continued its relentless spread inland. The narrow streets acted as funnels, guiding the flames forward. Homes, shops, and workshops ignited in rapid succession. Wood snapped and hissed. Shutters crumpled. Roofs sagged and collapsed with a sound like distant thunder. Some people attempted to fight the fire with buckets of water, but the heat pushed them back again and again, forcing them to abandon their efforts. Families fled through streets thick with smoke, holding cloths to their mouths to breathe. Mothers carried crying children. Elderly residents leaned heavily on younger relatives as they moved as quickly as they could. The air shimmered with heat, dust, and sparks. Everywhere, people shouted, calling for loved ones, warning neighbors, begging for help. It was a moment of confusion and terror, softened only by the determination of people trying desperately to survive. Throughout the city, church bells rang. Their tolling had always been a familiar sound, a symbol of daily life, but now the bells carried a different weight, a warning echoing across London that the fire was moving faster than anyone had imagined. From high towers and hilltops, the smoke could be seen twisting upward into the sky, thick and dark, blotting out the sun in patches. Word reached King Charles II and his brother, the Duke of York, that the fire was out of control. The king immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. Unlike the Lord Mayor, he did not hesitate. He ordered that buildings in the fire's path be torn down to create fire breaks, granting full royal authority for any necessary destruction. But in many places, the flames had advanced so quickly that there was little time to act. Still, soldiers and volunteers began to dismantle houses where they could, desperately trying to stop the fire's advance. Despite these efforts, the wind carried the fire onward. The flames now moved towards some of the city's busiest areas, Cheapside, the markets, and the commercial heart of London. Shopkeepers rushed to save their goods. Laborers joined bucket lines. Clergy attempted to protect their churches, though many already feared what the day might bring. By late afternoon, the fire was no longer just a neighborhood tragedy or a passing danger. It had become a force that threatened the soul of the city itself. Streets glowed red from reflected flame. Smoke filled the sky like a rising storm, and Londoners, exhausted and fearful, realized that the fire would not easily be stopped. As night approached once again, the flames continued their advance. drawing strength from every building they touched.
As the second night approached, London glowed like a furnace. The setting sun blended with the brightness of the flames until it was impossible to tell where daylight ended and the fire began. A warm, unsettling light washed over rooftops and church spires, flickering softly like the pulse of a living creature. Even miles away, travelers paused in their journeys as they saw the sky above London shimmering with shifting shades of red and gold. For the people still in the city, the night brought no rest. The fire, fed by the wind and the tightly packed wooden buildings, surged with renewed strength. Flames crawled along upper stories, leapt across alleyways, and clung to roofs like glowing vines. Sparks rained down onto the streets, carried by the restless wind. Every time someone believed they had slowed the fire, a sudden gust pushed it forward again, undoing hours of desperate work. Families continued their frantic efforts to flee. The narrow lanes of the city were filled with people moving quietly but anxiously, carrying bundles of clothing, small chests, and treasured belongings wrapped in cloth. Some pushed carts overflowing with whatever they could save. Others carried little more than a blanket or a single cherished item. The further they moved from the flames, the thicker the crowds became, as frightened residents merged into long, slow-moving streams of people heading toward open fields or the river. Along the Thames, hundreds gathered near the water's edge. Boats lined the shore, some ferrying people away, others already packed with goods rescued from shops and warehouses. The river became a lifeline, guiding people to safety on the southern bank or farther east. From the water, the view was overwhelming. A wall of fire stretching across the city, dancing wildly as the wind carried the flames higher and higher. On land, soldiers and volunteers worked tirelessly through the night. They tore down houses, cleared debris, and tried to create lines of defense. The king's presence in the fire zones inspired many. Charles II walked among the workers in plain clothes, offering encouragement and sometimes even lifting buckets himself. His brother, the Duke of York, coordinated groups of men with calm authority. Their efforts brought a sense of order to the chaos, though even they could not fully stop the fire's relentless march. Churches that had stood for centuries were now vulnerable. Many tried to save sacred objects, carrying out books, silver chalices, and tapestries. Some clergy remained inside their churches longer than they should have, hoping the thick stone walls would resist the flames. But the heat was merciless. Windows shattered, roofs collapsed, wooden beams cracked and fell in showers of sparks. And yet, even in the midst of fear and exhaustion, moments of quiet dignity appeared. Neighbors helped each other without hesitation. Strangers shared water, food, and blankets. Families sheltered those who had nowhere else to go. It was as if the fire, in destroying so much, revealed the deep compassion hidden within the city's heart. As midnight came and went, the fire continued its long march westward. Whole blocks disappeared into glowing ruins. The sound of burning timber filled the air like the steady roar of distant waves. The wind carried the heat and the smell of smoke far beyond the city, touching fields, farms, and villages in the outskirts. But despite the destruction, Londoners did not give up hope. They held on to the belief that the fire could still be stopped, that the city could survive, that dawn might bring a turning point. And so they worked on, hour after hour, their silhouettes moving through the orange glow like calm, determined shadows. By the time the sky began to pale with the first hint of morning, the fire had traveled deeper into the center of London, and new challenges awaited.
As dawn rose on the third day of the fire, the city seemed to exist inside a strange, glowing mist. Smoke wrapped itself around rooftops and drifted through streets like a heavy, shifting fog. The rising sun, filtered through layers of ash, appeared pale and distant, a dim circle struggling to pierce the haze. For Londoners, it was another morning without rest, another day in which the fire continued to shape their fate. The flames, strengthened by the night's winds, were now moving dangerously close to the very center of the city. Cheapside, one of London's busiest and most important marketplaces, stood directly in the fire's path. Known for its bustling shops, traders' stalls, and constant activity, Cheapside had long been a symbol of the city's energy and prosperity. But this morning, the marketplace was eerily quiet, its goods hurriedly removed or abandoned, and its merchants watching helplessly as smoke drifted toward their wooden roofs. By mid-morning, the fire reached the eastern end of Cheapside. Sparks and embers landed on roofs, smoldered for a few seconds, and then burst into flame. The sight sent a fresh wave of fear through the crowd. Traders who had hoped to defend their shops now faced the inevitable. They gathered their families and joined the flow of people moving away from the advancing heat. The fire spread quickly along the length of the street, consuming stalls of cloth, leather, spices, and household goods. Storage rooms packed with oils and dried materials ignited instantly, releasing sudden bursts of flame that leapt across entire rows of shops. The marketplace, once filled with voices and laughter, became a corridor of roaring fire, its wooden structures crumbling one after another. Nearby, the flames approached the Royal Exchange, the center of London's business world. Merchants and bankers had already rushed to remove books, contracts, and valuables, hoping to save at least a part of their livelihoods. But the speed of the fire made their efforts heartbreaking. The exchange, with its grand design and spacious courtyard, quickly became a furnace. Flames climbed its walls, filling the arcades with smoke and turning its open spaces into swirling chambers of heat. As the destruction spread, crowds gathered again at the river, hoping the water would offer refuge. The Thames filled with small boats, some carrying families to safety and others weighed down with rescued possessions. The river's surface reflected the fire's glow, turning the water into a long ribbon of moving light. From the boats, people watched the city burn, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, sadness, and quiet endurance. Throughout the day, King Charles II and the Duke of York continued their efforts to stop the fire. Under the king's direct orders, soldiers and laborers tore down buildings in the fire's path with renewed determination. The sound of collapsing walls echoed through the smoky air, mixing with the roar of the flames. For the first time, some firebreaks managed to slow the fire's advance, though only briefly. The wind still carried burning debris far beyond the lines of demolished houses. Churches continued to fall. Their spires, long familiar landmarks to the city's residents, were now blackened silhouettes against the glowing sky. When the roofs collapsed, showers of sparks spiraled upward, drifting like fiery snowflakes before disappearing into the smoky air. Even sturdy stone walls eventually gave way as the heat intensified. But despite the destruction, Londoners showed remarkable courage. Bucket lines stretched across squares. Volunteers carried water, tools, and food to the exhausted workers. Families supported strangers. Clergy comforted the fearful. In every corner of the city, people found small ways to protect one another. Still, as evening approached once more, the fire continued its march westward, toward the political and cultural heart of London, the area surrounding St. Paul's Cathedral. And the next chapter of the disaster would unfold there, in a place many had believed was indestructible.
As the fire pressed deeper into London, it moved toward one of the city's most cherished landmarks, St. Paul's Cathedral. For centuries, St. Paul's had stood tall above the surrounding streets, its spire rising confidently over the rooftops. To many Londoners, it felt eternal, a structure of thick stone, heavy pillars, and broad walls that seemed far too solid to ever be touched by fire. Even as the flames consumed homes and markets, many believed that St. Paul's would survive, protecting the treasures stored within its great halls. The cathedral had become a place of refuge. Printers, booksellers, and merchants brought their goods inside, believing that the stone vaults would shield them from the spreading fire. Inside the vast nave, stacks of books, documents, and precious items filled every corner. Candles flickered softly, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Outside, people moved with a sense of reassurance, trusting that this great building would remain untouched. Yet, despite its strength, St. Paul's had a hidden vulnerability. The cathedral's roof was made of ancient timber, coated with layers of pitch to keep out rain, a combination that made it dangerously flammable. When the fire reached the nearby booksellers' shops, flames climbed the wooden scaffolding surrounding the cathedral, which had been erected for long-term repairs. These dry planks, exposed to months of summer heat, ignited quickly. Soon the scaffolding blazed like a tower of torches leaning against the stone walls. The wind, still strong and restless, drove embers against the cathedral's roof. People standing in the churchyard watched anxiously as small sparks landed on the darkened surface. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, wisps of smoke rose from the roofline. A quiet gasp passed through the crowd. Within moments, the smoke thickened, changing from pale gray to a darker, more troubling shade. The roof had begun to smolder. Once the flames found the timber beneath the protective lead covering, they spread rapidly. The heat grew intense, so powerful that it caused the sheets of lead to melt and flow like streams of molten silver, dripping down the walls and forming shining rivulets on the ground. People stared in disbelief as the fire consumed what they had believed was indestructible. Inside, those who had stored goods realized their terrible mistake. Smoke poured into the cathedral's halls, swirling among the wooden stalls and rising toward the great arches above. Many rushed to save books, but the fire advanced too quickly. Whole piles of manuscripts ignited, turning to ash within seconds. The sound of burning wood echoed through the vast space, mixing with the low rumble of collapsing beams. Outside, crowds stood silently as the flames climbed higher. The great spire, which had dominated the skyline for generations, glowed first with a dull red heat. Then, as the fire reached its core, the spire ignited from within. A deep roar followed, a sound that many witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. St. Paul's spire, once a proud symbol of the city, collapsed in a shower of sparks and debris, sending a towering plume of fire into the air. The collapse marked a turning point in the minds of many Londoners. If St. Paul's could fall, then no building in the city was safe. Yet the moment also brought a strange stillness, a sense of collective awe and sorrow. People watched quietly, some with tears in their eyes, as the cathedral continued to burn through the night. The sky above the ruins glowed brightly, casting a warm, flickering light that reached far across London.
As the fire continued its relentless journey across London, thousands of people found themselves on the move, drifting through the city like quiet waves pushed forward by heat and fear. The destruction of St. Paul's Cathedral had shaken the confidence of even the bravest citizens. Many who had stayed behind to protect their homes now realized that they too had to flee before the flames reached their doorsteps. The streets were filled with families carrying bundles of possessions wrapped in cloth, balancing chests on carts or guiding livestock through the smoke. Some led dogs on makeshift ropes. Others carried children who were too tired to walk. Each group moved steadily, slowly, and without loud panic, not because they felt calm, but because exhaustion had softened their voices and movements. After days without rest, people walked almost dreamlike, following the flow of the crowd. Large open spaces, such as Moorfields and the fields beyond the city walls, transformed into temporary camps. Here, Londoners gathered in quiet clusters, sitting on blankets or placing salvaged furniture around them like fragile islands of familiarity. Campfires glowed gently in the smoky dusk, and the murmured voices of families blended into a soft, continuous hum. Among the fearful murmurs were words of comfort, stories shared to distract children, and gentle reassurances whispered in the dim light. Those who had fled earlier were already settled in these makeshift refuges. Some had brought small tables, trunks, or bedding from their homes, creating little corners that resembled rooms they had left behind. Others had brought almost nothing, finding shelter under the open sky. And though fear lingered everywhere, the shared struggle created a sense of unity that gave people the strength to endure the long hours ahead. From these fields, the view of the burning city was both breathtaking and heartbreaking. The skyline glowed like a distant horizon of fire, with tall flames rising and falling in slow, restless motions. The smoke curled upward in thick spirals, blotting out stars and dimming the moon. Many sat quietly, watching the city that had shaped their lives slowly disappear into glowing embers. Some prayed softly, while others simply held hands and stared in silence. Throughout the flow of people, soldiers and volunteers moved with purpose. They guided families toward safer routes, delivered water to the camps, and reassured those who feared they had nowhere else to go. Their presence brought a sense of order to the drifting crowds. In the midst of so much uncertainty, their calm voices and steady movements were small but powerful sources of comfort. The king and his advisors traveled between the fire lines and the crowded fields. Their expressions were grave but composed. Charles II stopped often to speak with displaced families, offering reassurance and promising support. His appearance among the people created a quiet ripple of hope, reminding them that they were not abandoned.
Even in chaos, their leaders stood beside them. As more homes fell, the flow of refugees increased. Streets became rivers of movement, all heading away from the advancing fire. But despite the exhaustion, there was little anger among the people, only a deep shared sadness and a determination to survive together. Neighbors who might barely have spoken before now lent each other strength. Strangers shared food. Families sheltered those who had none. In this great scattering of lives, London rediscovered its compassion. By the time night settled over the city once more, the fire's glow illuminated the fields where thousands had gathered. The air was cool, filled with the faint scent of smoke drifting like distant memory. Children finally drifted to sleep in their mother's arms. Elders closed their eyes, whispering quiet prayers for dawn. Amid the devastation, a fragile peace settled over the camps. But the fire was still burning fiercely in the city, and its path had not yet completed its terrible arc.
By the fourth day, the fire had begun to approach the western edges of London. Though its path had been slowed in some places by demolished buildings and fire breaks, the wind continued to carry sparks across streets and rooftops. Even with these obstacles, the flames still seemed to move with purpose, leaping from house to house, consuming everything in their path. The city was a shifting landscape of light and shadow, with glowing timber falling like gentle rainfall from the night sky. The residents who had remained in the city until the last moments were now caught between fleeing the fire and rescuing what they could of their homes. Many carried bundles of clothing, silverware, and treasured books, hurrying along streets thick with ash. Dogs, cats, and other animals followed closely, some frightened, others exhausted. Families clung together, holding hands, whispering softly to calm the children who had not slept properly in days. The city's usual bustle had been replaced by quiet, urgent motion, like a slow river of people moving steadily away from the advancing heat. The western districts held some of London's grandest buildings, yet their size and elegance offered little protection against the relentless flames. Guild halls, warehouses, and merchant homes, often packed with wood, oil, and textiles, erupted suddenly as the fire found its fuel. Sparks leapt from roof to roof, carried by the slightest gust of wind, igniting places that had seemed safe only moments before. The roar of collapsing timber and the occasional cry of distress echoed through narrow lanes, filling the air with an uneasy rhythm. Even the city's narrow alleys acted like funnels, carrying both the heat and the people forward. Smoke hung thick, curling around corners, drifting into squares, and climbing the remains of church towers. The smell of burning wood, pitch, and fabric was pervasive, a heavy scent that would remain in memory for years to come. Yet among the fear and exhaustion, there was still remarkable calm. Londoners moved with purpose, speaking quietly, helping one another when a bundle fell or a frightened child cried. Despite the fire's fury, compassion remained visible in every careful gesture. Officials and volunteers, under the direction of King Charles II, continued to tear down buildings ahead of the fire, attempting to create fire breaks that could save part of the city. Soldiers worked tirelessly, and carpenters used hammers and axes to dismantle walls and roofs.
Though the effort slowed the flames in some areas, it could not fully stop them. The fire's energy was immense, and it seemed to consume everything in its path without hesitation. By evening, the fire had finally begun to reach the limits of the most densely packed areas where many of London's wealthiest merchants had lived. Their large homes, packed with both precious goods and highly flammable materials, provided one final surge of fuel. The flames roared as they leapt from floor to floor, collapsing beams and shattering windows. Even the sturdier stone structures were scorched and blackened. By nightfall, a river of glowing embers traced the path the fire had taken, illuminating the streets and riverbanks in a soft orange glow. As darkness fell, Londoners gathered once more in fields and along the river, watching the city's last burning blocks with quiet awe. Their faces were streaked with soot and fatigue, yet they stood together, a community forged by fire and survival. Though the destruction was immense, the spirit of the city remained unbroken. Londoners knew the fire would end, as all fires eventually do, and in the waiting silence, they began to dream of what would come next.
As the first pale light of dawn seeped into the smoke-hushed sky, London revealed a sight so unfamiliar that many who witnessed it later said they felt as though they had woken in another world. The wind, which had tormented the city for days, finally calmed, allowing the last of the drifting embers to cool atop heaps of ash and charred timber. The fire, which had seemed unstoppable, was at last little more than scattered wisps rising from smoldering ruins. For the first time since the disaster began, silence returned to the heart of the city, a heavy, almost sacred quiet, as if London itself was catching its breath after a long and terrible ordeal. People stepped cautiously back into the streets where their homes had once stood, their movements slow, reverent, and tinged with disbelief. The absence of familiar landmarks created an eerie sensation. Streets that had once wound through vibrant neighborhoods were now open expanses of gray dust. Whole districts had vanished. The old, narrow lanes of medieval London no longer existed, replaced instead by a landscape that stretched out in bleak, unbroken lines. Some wandered as though lost, unable to identify where they were without the buildings that once framed their lives. Others stood still, staring into the distance, their expressions unreadable beneath layers of soot. Yet among the grief and confusion, there was also a quiet resilience. Families who had slept in fields, along riverbanks, or in makeshift camps began to gather what little remained from the wreckage. A few pieces of scorched furniture, a metal pot, a fragment of a signboard. Objects that once seemed ordinary had suddenly become priceless. Even these small discoveries were treated like treasures, reminders that not everything had been taken by the flames. Small clusters of survivors exchanged stories in low, tired voices. They spoke of narrow escapes, of neighbors who had helped them, of streets that vanished in moments, and of the strange glow that had lit the night sky for days. Though each person had lived through the same event, each carried a different memory, some filled with fear, others with awe, and many with a feeling too deep for words. As the morning grew brighter, officials, carpenters,
Soldiers and laborers began moving into the city to assess what was left. Their footsteps left clear impressions in the ash, a reminder that even in destruction, movement continued forward. The fire's path could now be traced with painful clarity. Great St. Paul's, once towering with serene certainty, was a hollow shell. Entire marketplaces had vanished. Homes of the wealthy and the poor alike had been humbled to the same gray ground. London's familiar skyline had collapsed into a single vast plain. But in this quiet dawn, something else was taking shape amid the stillness, a gentle sense of unity. Strangers shared food with strangers. People offered comforting words to those who stood mourning their losses. Londoners who had always lived in close quarters now found themselves bound even more closely through shared suffering. And in this collective moment, a subtle strength emerged, the beginnings of acceptance and the earliest sparks of determination. For while the flames had taken much, they had not taken London's spirit. Beneath the ruins lay a city ready to be reborn, its future still uncertain, but its people unwilling to surrender to despair. The silence of the morning was not the silence of defeat, but the stillness before rebuilding began, a pause between tragedy and renewal, a breath before the long work ahead. Morning broke over London for the first time in days without the roar of flames. The fire had run its course, leaving behind streets and neighborhoods transformed into vast expanses of ash, smoldering timber, and collapsed walls. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and charred wood, and thin wisps of lingering embers drifted lazily upward, disappearing into a pale, sunlit sky. For the city's residents, the silence was profound, almost dreamlike, as if London itself had paused to breathe. People emerged cautiously from the makeshift shelters where they had spent the night. Some had camped in fields outside the city walls. Others had slept along the riverbanks. As they stepped back into the ruined streets, they were met with the scene both shocking and strangely beautiful. Sunlight reflected off the glowing remnants of charred timber and ash, bathing the city in a warm, muted glow. The ruins had a stark elegance, the skeletal remains of buildings rising like quiet monuments to what had been. Families moved slowly through the streets, collecting whatever they could salvage from the rubble. Small pieces of pottery, fragments of furniture, and scorched personal items became treasures, held carefully in hands still trembling from fear and exhaustion. Neighbors assisted one another, lifting collapsed beams, brushing away ash, and sharing what little they had rescued. In these quiet, purposeful movements, a remarkable sense of community emerged, a soft resilience that promised London would endure. Amid the ruins, familiar landmarks could be recognized only by memory. St. Paul's Cathedral was reduced to a hollow shell, its great spire collapsed, its roof gone. Markets that had thrived just days before were now flattened plains of ash. Yet even in destruction, the city's outline persisted. Streets, alleys, and squares marked by the space once occupied by houses and shops. It was a city transformed, yes, but not erased. London still stood, patient and enduring, beneath the weight of the fire's aftermath.
Officials and soldiers moved among the survivors, assessing damage and organizing recovery. King Charles II himself walked through the streets, offering reassurance, calming fears, and instructing teams to clear debris and mark dangerous areas. The king's presence brought a quiet sense of stability. Volunteers began creating temporary shelters and helping families reclaim possessions from the ruins. It was painstaking work, slow and methodical, but necessary. Even amid such devastation, life persisted. Birds returned to the quiet rooftops. Watermen on the Thames resumed gentle rowing, carrying families and salvaged goods. Smoke still curled in thin spirals above the ruined city, but the roar and crackle of active fire had vanished. The calm that settled over London that morning was profound, a delicate pause after the storm, allowing people to reflect, grieve, and gather strength. Children, who had been wide-eyed with fear during the fire, began to explore cautiously with their parents, peering among the ruins with curiosity and wonder. Adults, exhausted from days of relentless activity, paused to rest and to plan. London, though scarred, remained alive, not in the form it had known before, but in a quieter, more deliberate rhythm that whispered of renewal. And so, with the fire finally extinguished, Londoners faced their next challenge, rebuilding a city from ashes, brick by brick, heart by heart.
In the days following the fire, Londoners began the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding their city. The streets, once filled with the roar of flames, now hummed softly with the quiet rhythm of hammers, saws, and carts carrying timber and stone. Volunteers and craftsmen moved carefully among the ruins, clearing debris and marking what could be salvaged. There was a sense of purpose in every action, a shared understanding that the city could rise again, even from such devastation. Temporary shelters were constructed for those who had lost their homes. Tents and simple wooden huts dotted the edges of the cleared streets, providing safety and shelter while rebuilding began. Families who had spent nights in open fields or along the river now had a small, steady place to rest. Community kitchens appeared, where neighbors shared what food remained and offered comfort to one another. Amid the hardship, Londoners discovered a renewed sense of solidarity, each helping the other with quiet determination. One of the first priorities was ensuring that vital goods and services could return to the city. Markets were slowly restored on cleared ground, using temporary stalls and tables. Bakers, who had narrowly escaped the destruction of their ovens, began setting up new hearths. Blacksmiths returned to their forges. Carpenters and masons who had watched their workshops burn worked tirelessly to craft the materials needed to rebuild homes, shops, and public buildings. The rhythm of reconstruction brought a calming order after the chaos of the fire, and in the process, the city began to heal both physically and emotionally. King Charles II and his advisors played an active role in planning the reconstruction. Royal surveys assessed the damage, and new regulations were proposed to ensure that buildings would be stronger and safer in the future. Streets were redesigned with wider lanes to prevent such rapid spread of fire. Stone and brick were encouraged over timber. Open squares and fire breaks were planned to give the city both beauty and protection. Though it would take years to see these plans fully realized, the seeds of a safer, more resilient London were being planted. Churches,
many reduced to charred shells, were among the earliest structures to be addressed. St. Paul's, though heavily damaged, became a symbol of hope. Clearing the ruins and salvaging what remained of its treasures began almost immediately. In small ways, Londoners celebrated even minor victories: a partially intact wall, a recovered statue, or a safe return of books and manuscripts. Each act, however small, contributed to a collective sense that the city would endure. Alongside practical reconstruction, the city also began to address the emotional toll of the fire. Families mourned the loss of homes, businesses, and familiar landmarks. Yet in quiet gatherings and soft conversations, they shared memories and stories, reminding one another of the life that had existed and would exist again. Children returned to their play, running among cleared streets and temporary homes. Their laughter, faint but persistent, became a symbol of the city's resilience, carrying hope above the ashes. Even as the physical rebuilding commenced, the memory of the fire lingered. Londoners recalled the nights of flames, the glowing skyline, and the collapse of familiar structures. But instead of despair, these memories inspired careful planning and determination. Lessons were learned not in haste or panic, but in the quiet understanding that life, much like the city itself, could be renewed with patience, courage, and care. London, scarred but unbroken, was beginning to emerge from the shadows of its past. From ash and ruin, a city was quietly preparing to rise again. As the weeks passed after the fire, the city's rebuilding took on a steady, measured rhythm. Streets that had been reduced to ash and rubble were gradually cleared, and foundations were marked for new homes and shops. The air was filled with the gentle sounds of hammers tapping, saws cutting timber, and the quiet murmur of workers coordinating their efforts. It was a slower, more intentional pace than the chaos of the fire, and it carried with it a sense of calm determination. The first priority for most residents was to rebuild their homes. Families who had lost everything worked alongside neighbors and skilled craftsmen to raise new walls. Brick replaced timber in many places, a conscious choice to prevent such destruction from happening again. Roofs were carefully constructed with fire-resistant materials, and chimneys were designed to vent smoke safely. Windows were framed with care, and doors were aligned along wider streets that now allowed sunlight and fresh air to reach every corner. The city, once narrow and tangled, began to breathe again. Shopkeepers and merchants returned with their goods, carefully unpacking the small belongings salvaged from the fire. Many had lost more than their homes. Livelihoods had been swept away in a single night. Yet the act of reopening stalls, setting up counters, and arranging products brought a sense of normalcy and control. Markets slowly regained their gentle rhythm, with the soft chatter of buyers and sellers returning to streets that had been filled with smoke and panic just weeks before. The streets themselves were redesigned to create order and safety. Cobbled roads replaced uneven lanes, and open squares were created to act as natural fire breaks. Trees and small gardens were planted where possible, softening the new cityscape and offering quiet spaces for reflection. In these early months, the careful rebuilding of streets and homes became a kind of meditation for the residents. Each stone laid and each beam raised was a quiet assertion that life continued and that the city would endure. Craftsmen of all kinds, masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and glaziers, contributed their skills with care and precision. They built not only for utility, but for beauty. Decorative facades, orderly windows, and thoughtful layouts transformed the city into a place that felt safer, calmer, and more enduring than before. Each new building carried the promise of resilience, a quiet determination that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Amid all this work, life slowly resumed its ordinary rhythm. Children played in cleared streets and open squares, their laughter echoing softly against the rising walls. Families gathered in small groups, sharing meals and stories. Markets became centers of gentle activity rather than chaotic hustle. Even in the midst of rebuilding, there was space for reflection, for rest, and for a subtle, comforting rhythm that suggested hope. The city was no longer the one that had been swept by flames, but it was becoming something new, a London that remembered its past, yet looked deliberately toward the future. In every brick, every carefully aligned street, and every newly planted tree, there was the quiet pulse of renewal.
As the city's streets and homes began to take shape, attention turned to public buildings and churches, the heart of London's community life. These structures had been both symbols of civic pride and practical centers of daily activity. The fire had left many of them reduced to stone skeletons, charred timbers, and collapsed roofs. Yet, from the rubble, the people of London saw an opportunity, not only to rebuild, but to reimagine their city with care, safety, and beauty. Clergy and parishioners led the early efforts in church reconstruction. St. Paul's Cathedral, though heavily damaged, became a powerful symbol of hope and determination. Plans were drawn for its eventual restoration, with engineers and architects envisioning a structure stronger than the one lost to flames. Smaller churches were rebuilt with fire-resistant materials, their steeples and towers carefully designed to rise above the newly laid streets. Stone replaced wood where possible, and designs included wider aisles, more open interiors, and better access to natural light. Each church that rose again offered Londoners a place of spiritual solace and community gathering. Public buildings, including guild halls, markets, and municipal offices, were also carefully restored. Craftsmen worked alongside civic leaders to ensure that these structures could serve the city safely and efficiently. Large halls were rebuilt with durable materials and high ceilings, offering open spaces for markets, meetings, and community events. Guild halls were reconstructed with attention to both function and elegance, their facades reflecting pride and careful planning. Even the smallest public buildings were crafted with thoughtfulness, a testament to the city's resilience and foresight. And Londoners themselves contributed tirelessly. Families volunteered in clearing debris, carrying materials, and assisting artisans. Even children found ways to help, fetching small tools, carrying bundles, or keeping spirits high with soft laughter. In every corner, a rhythm of cooperation emerged, a quiet pulse of effort that brought life back to streets once dominated by smoke and flame. In these months, the city began to take on a new identity. The scars of fire were still visible, yet the renewed churches, public buildings, and civic spaces spoke of foresight and careful planning. The streets now accommodated wider access, buildings were safer,
and open squares offered both beauty and utility. London was slowly becoming not just a restored city, but a city wiser and stronger than before. And while the city grew outward and upward, the hearts of its residents held on to the lessons of the fire, the fragility of life, the strength of community, and the quiet persistence of hope.
As the city emerged from the devastation of the Great Fire, London's reconstruction became more than a return to the past. It was an opportunity to reimagine the city with wisdom, resilience, and a new aesthetic that combined practicality with quiet beauty. Architects, craftsmen, and city planners worked together to create streets, homes, and public spaces that would withstand the dangers of the past while offering comfort, light, and elegance for the future. One of the striking changes was in building materials. Timber, which had once carried the flames quickly from house to house, was gradually replaced with brick and stone. Roofs were covered with tiles or slate instead of pitch-coated wood, reducing the risk of fire. Chimneys were redesigned to vent smoke safely, and the alignment of streets was adjusted to allow fresh air and sunlight to reach even the narrowest corners. Every choice, though small, contributed to a city that would be stronger, safer, and more enduring. Streets themselves were carefully redesigned. The narrow, winding lanes of medieval London were gradually replaced or widened, allowing room for markets, carriages, and pedestrians to move with ease. Open squares were incorporated into neighborhoods, creating natural fire breaks and places for calm and reflection. These public spaces offered calm pockets in the busy city, softening the urban landscape and providing places for quiet gatherings, gentle conversation, or simple moments of pause. The architecture of new buildings blended elegance with function. Homes were built with orderly facades, proportioned windows, and decorative brickwork that reflected both pride and stability. Shops were designed with wider fronts and safer construction, ensuring that trade could continue in comfort and security. Public buildings, from guild halls to civic offices, were raised with thoughtful consideration of light, space, and durability. The city's new architecture carried a sense of calm order, a soft rhythm that matched the gentle pulse of its recovering citizens. Churches, too, were transformed. Architects embraced both traditional and innovative designs, ensuring that sacred spaces could accommodate worship, community gatherings, and reflection safely. Towers rose taller yet sturdier, roofs were fireproof, and interiors were open and inviting. St. Paul's Cathedral, a symbol of the city's endurance, became the focal point for this architectural vision. Though its complete rebuilding would take decades, the planning and early construction laid the foundation for a structure that would inspire awe for generations to come. Beyond materials and design, the city adopted new planning principles. Streets were laid out with broader intersections, open marketplaces, and strategically placed fire breaks. Londoners had learned from the fire that a thoughtful city was a safer city, and so the rebuilding process was careful, deliberate, and imbued with a sense of shared responsibility. Each brick, each beam, and each newly paved street represented not only reconstruction, but a commitment to the future. In this quiet transformation, Londoners discovered a subtle truth: that even after the most devastating disaster, life could continue with purpose, beauty, and resilience. The city rising from ashes was no longer simply a collection of buildings. It was a testament to human determination, foresight, and hope. As weeks turned into months, life in London began to settle into a quiet rhythm.
The roar of the flames was gone, replaced by the soft sounds of hammers, saws, and carts moving along newly cleared streets. Children played cautiously in open squares, their laughter a delicate thread weaving through the calm of the recovering city. Markets reopened slowly, the gentle chatter of merchants and buyers restoring a comforting sense of normalcy. Homes, rebuilt with stronger materials and safer designs, became havens once again. Families who had lost everything now cultivated small gardens in courtyards or along streets, planting herbs, vegetables, and flowers. The simple act of tending to plants became a soothing ritual, a quiet expression of hope and continuity. Windows were cleaned, shutters repaired, and doors repainted, each small task a marker of life returning to order. Trade resumed in cautious but steady steps. Bakers rekindled ovens, filling the air with the soft, familiar scent of bread. Blacksmiths worked quietly, hammering iron into tools and implements necessary for rebuilding. Carpenters, masons, and artisans labored with care, their work echoing a soft rhythm throughout neighborhoods. The city's heartbeat was no longer the frantic pace of survival, but the measured cadence of life gradually resuming. Evenings were peaceful. As the sun dipped behind the newly aligned rooftops, a gentle glow fell across the streets, softening the edges of charred remnants that had yet to be fully cleared. Families gathered for quiet meals, sharing stories of the fire and its aftermath in hushed voices. Some visited neighbors, offering comfort and sharing what food, clothing, or tools they could spare. In every quiet gesture, Londoners reinforced the bonds of community that had carried them through disaster. The city's churches, reopened in stages, became centers of reflection and gentle gathering. People attended services not only for worship, but for the calm reassurance of shared presence. Clergy offered comfort, guidance, and soft words of encouragement, helping citizens process the trauma of the fire while fostering hope for the future. The echo of soft prayers in these rebuilt spaces became a comforting soundtrack to the gentle hum of daily life. In the marketplaces and streets, craftsmen displayed their restored wares with quiet pride. Merchants carefully arranged goods, mindful that their livelihoods depended not only on trade, but on the trust and calm of the community. Buyers browsed with a sense of peace, no longer in fear, but in the quiet certainty that London was a city that could endure.
As months passed and London continued to rebuild, the city's daily life returned in a quiet, purposeful rhythm. Trade, which had once been interrupted by smoke and ash, gradually revived. Markets reopened fully, with merchants displaying fabrics, spices, pottery, and everyday goods in carefully arranged stalls. The soft hum of conversation, the gentle clink of coins, and the quiet steps of shoppers moving along newly paved streets became familiar and comforting sounds, reminders that life continued after disaster. Merchants and craftsmen, once scattered and displaced, found new homes for their shops and workshops. Blacksmiths forged tools and utensils. Carpenters shaped furniture, and masons repaired stonework with steady hands. Each day of work brought more than income. It brought stability, a quiet reassurance that the city could support its people once again. Even small trades, a baker kneading dough, a tailor stitching fabric, a candlemaker shaping wax, became part of a delicate rhythm that wove the city's life together. Community bonds deepened as neighbors helped one another in practical and meaningful ways. Families shared meals, offered shelter,
and exchanged tools or materials to aid in rebuilding. In the quiet evenings, children played together in open squares and along streets cleared of debris, their laughter soft and comforting, blending with the gentle murmur of adults at work or in conversation. Life had returned, but it was measured, careful, and enriched with a new appreciation for togetherness. The lessons of the fire also influenced daily routines. People were more mindful of safety. Homes were built with fire-resistant materials. Chimneys were cleaned regularly, and open hearths were tended with care. Streets were kept clear and wide, ensuring that passage was easy and that emergency routes were always accessible. Even small details, a carefully placed water bucket, a well-maintained lane, reflected a quiet vigilance born from experience. In addition to practical recovery, cultural life began to re-emerge. Churches held services and community gatherings, offering calm moments of reflection and soft encouragement. Public halls hosted discussions about rebuilding, education, and trade, fostering thoughtful engagement and quiet collaboration. Londoners celebrated the resilience of their city, not with grand fanfare, but with small, deliberate acts of care, work, and shared presence. The Thames, which had carried so many fleeing citizens during the fire, resumed its role as the lifeline of trade and communication. Boats glided along the water, transporting goods, families, and artisans. The gentle ripple of the river and the muted creak of oars became a comforting backdrop to the city's soft revival. The movement along the river reminded everyone that London's heart, its commerce, its community, and its spirit continued to beat steadily even after the devastation. And in this quiet return to normalcy, Londoners began to truly feel the strength of a city reborn from ashes.
In the years following the Great Fire, London's transformation extended beyond rebuilding homes and businesses. The city's leaders, craftsmen, and architects worked together to rethink London as a safer, more organized, and enduring place. Streets were widened, irregular lanes were straightened, and open squares were strategically placed to create natural fire breaks. These changes gave the city both beauty and function, allowing light to reach the streets, air to circulate freely, and movement to flow smoothly even in busy neighborhoods. Urban planning became a quiet form of protection. Buildings were constructed with fire-resistant materials. Chimneys were carefully designed, and rooftops were less crowded and more orderly. Regulations encouraged the use of brick and stone, reducing the risk of another rapid-spreading fire. Public spaces, gardens, and parks began to appear in areas cleared of destruction, offering soft, peaceful places for reflection, rest, and community gatherings. London was no longer just a collection of buildings. It was a thoughtfully designed city, mindful of safety and aesthetic harmony. The rebuilding also fostered innovation. Architects experimented with new designs for homes, churches, and civic buildings. St. Paul's Cathedral, planned anew, became the centerpiece of these architectural achievements, symbolizing both faith and resilience. Smaller churches incorporated wider aisles and improved ventilation, while guild halls and municipal offices embraced functionality, durability, and elegance. Each building, each street reflected lessons learned from the fire. A city reimagined not only for beauty, but for lasting safety. Trade and commerce, too, adapted to the new cityscape. Wider streets and organized markets allowed smoother flow of goods, making daily life calmer and more efficient. Artisans, merchants, and craftsmen found renewed pride in their work, knowing that their contributions would shape a safer, more prosperous London. The Thames, still vital to trade and travel, continued to carry life and commerce, linking the city with the wider world. Socially, the fire had strengthened the bonds of the community. Families, neighbors, and strangers who had endured the disaster together shared a lasting sense of unity. In quiet moments, people reflected on their shared resilience, the acts of kindness that had carried them through, and the patient work that rebuilt both homes and spirits. Londoners carried the memory of the fire as a subtle guide, a reminder of fragility, courage, and the importance of foresight. Even decades later, the city bore the mark of that transformation. Streets were safer, buildings more durable, and the overall layout more thoughtful. Londoners lived with a quiet awareness of both the destruction that had come and the careful planning that had followed. The Great Fire of London, devastating though it had been, had inspired a rebirth, a measured, deliberate, and enduring renewal that allowed the city to flourish for generations to come. In every brick, every widened street, and every carefully designed square, the story of the fire remained, not as a source of fear, but as a testament to resilience, patience, and hope.
Even as the city's buildings and streets were restored, the memory of the Great Fire lived on in the hearts of Londoners. People spoke quietly of neighbors who had helped one another, of families who had lost everything yet found the strength to begin again, and of strangers who offered small but meaningful acts of kindness. These human stories became a living testament to courage, compassion, and resilience. Soft threads weaving together the fabric of a city reborn. Parents shared gentle stories with children about the nights of glowing skies and drifting ash, not to frighten them, but to teach lessons of preparedness, care, and community. Artisans spoke of the patience and skill required to rebuild what had been lost. Merchants told of the quiet determination needed to restart trade after months of interruption. Every retelling emphasized endurance and hope, reminding the city's residents that life could continue even after immense loss. The Great Fire also became a source of learning. Londoners reflected on how quickly timber structures could fuel disaster, how narrow streets could allow flames to leap rapidly, and how careful planning could prevent such destruction in the future. Builders and architects carried these lessons into each new project, designing homes, churches, and public buildings with safety and foresight. Streets were kept clear, fire breaks were respected, and materials were chosen thoughtfully. In these practical measures, the city ensured that the memory of the fire would guide rather than haunt future generations. Communities grew stronger through shared experience. People who had once been strangers found themselves connected by hardship and compassion. The slow rhythm of rebuilding, working together to clear streets, erect buildings, and tend gardens, reinforced a quiet sense of unity. In small, gentle ways, life regained its ordinary flow. Children played along newly laid streets, merchants reopened shops, and families settled into homes that were safer and more resilient than before. The fire had taken much, yet it could not take the spirit of London. Its people learned patience, foresight, and humility. They discovered the power of cooperation, the value of compassion, and the quiet strength
that arises when a community faces adversity together. And though the scars of the fire were visible for years, each one became a subtle reminder of the city's endurance and the careful, deliberate work that allowed London to rise from ashes.
Years passed, and London gradually transformed into a city that carried the memory of the Great Fire not as a source of fear, but as a quiet reminder of resilience and hope. The streets, once blackened with ash, were now lined with sturdy brick and stone buildings. Churches with taller, safer towers rose proudly above the city, their interiors filled with light and calm. Markets buzzed softly with trade, children laughed in open squares, and life moved at a gentle, deliberate pace. The people of London had rebuilt more than just homes and shops. They had reconstructed a sense of community, of shared purpose, and of patient determination. Families who had fled during the fire returned to neighborhoods that were safer, brighter, and more thoughtfully designed. Merchants and artisans once again filled their shops with goods, offering not only products but reassurance, a quiet affirmation that life could continue even after devastation. The Thames, which had carried countless families to safety, continued its gentle flow through the city, a symbol of continuity amid change. Its soft ripples reflected the new skyline, the careful planning of streets, and the enduring spirit of a city that had risen from ashes. Open squares and parks offered quiet spaces for reflection, places to pause and remember both what had been lost and what had been gained. Even St. Paul's Cathedral, once a hollowed shell, was slowly taking shape again, a testament to patient craftsmanship, careful design, and the determination to honor the past while looking forward. The cathedral, like the city itself, became a symbol of renewal, strength, and enduring hope. A reminder that even after the greatest disaster, life can be rebuilt with care, wisdom, and quiet courage. The lessons of the Great Fire were never forgotten. Londoners moved forward with an awareness of fragility and the importance of foresight, yet they also carried the knowledge that their city, their families, and their communities could endure. The ashes of the past had nurtured a city renewed, wiser, stronger, and more united than ever before. And so London lived on, its streets gently alive with the rhythm of daily life, its buildings standing proudly against the sky, and its people carrying the quiet, enduring strength of a city that had been reborn from ashes. The fire, once a source of terror, became a story of resilience, compassion, and hope. A gentle reminder that even in the darkest moments, a city, like its people, can rise again. Thank you for joining this calm journey through the Great Fire of London. If you enjoyed this peaceful retelling and would like more stories of history told softly for sleep, please subscribe and like this video.